We had an indication from the Home Affairs Minister last week that we are going to see major changes with migration, and that includes overseas students. The Minister outlining that overseas students coming to Australia and studying have effectively become more than half of our migration program by default. And she says it's not necessarily always aligned to our best interests in terms of skills. Joining me live is Universities Australia CEO Catriona Jackson. I was going to ask what you thought of all that. I did see you nodding along there. Do you agree with what the Minister outlined in terms of what problem there is at the moment?
Look, I think the Minister's made a really important contribution here, and we were absolutely behind the review of the migration system, because the reality is we have an incredible untapped resource here. Only 16% of those 400,000, about 400,000 international students in the country every year going through their degrees, only 16% of those really highly skilled individuals stay here. I think what the Minister's indicating is we have real potential to get more of those highly skilled workers. Just need to work a little bit harder to make sure we're tapping the right kind of people, right kind of reasons, smoothing out what is a lumpy, antiquated system to make sure we get the right people staying.
So at the moment is the issue that universities essentially, overseas students are great for universities. They pay top dollar, right? They help the
great for the economy function as well, Tom.
Yep, I'm saying, but obviously for the incentive, I'm just looking at the incentive side for universities.
Yeah.
But essentially, if however many people want to study this degree, they just say, well, the more the better. That there needs to be more of a direction, or perhaps unis work with the government, however it works, to better address skill shortages, because at the moment we end up with too many of one type of degree or skill and not enough of another. Is that fair enough?
So I think there's a confusion in that premise. So, yep, students come here to study things that will be good for them for the rest of their lives. Most of those students go home to the 144 countries they come from. So if they study accounting, or they study pottery, or they study philosophy or politics, that's really mostly for them about the choices they're making back in their home country. There are lots and lots of highly skilled international graduates who've invested in Australia who would stay here and become the doctors, the nurses, the physicians, the engineers that we need if we made the process at the end of their degree a little bit easier. If you've had the same experience that I've had, you get in an Uber, and a lot of the time you've got an international student who studied engineering or medicine and they're driving an Uber. Why on earth is that happening?
Yeah.
It's because there's a gap at the end of their degree where they have to do something other than their chosen speciality for 10, sometimes 11 months. That's a migration system problem.
Right.
That's easy to fix.
And that is easy to fix, and I don't think anyone would have a problem with that. The Minister's spoken about doing with that. So that's sort of the easy part. But the Minister did talk about also having people studying and sometimes staying here where it's not a skill shortage. So on the one hand, you make it easier for that cohort you were talking about to stay here. Let's improve the system. But would it necessarily be harder for other cohorts to stay here? And do you have any problem with that?
So we absolutely don't want students to think that coming here as a student is an automatic ticket to permanent migration. That is not the right way to go.
Is it how it's marketed in some places, though, that it'll make it easier? Because it does make it easier to come to Australia and stay here.
Well,
right?
Certainly you earn your stripes if you graduate through a degree and you've made a substantial contribution to the country, both socially, culturally and economically. We're not just talking about universities here. There's schools, there are vet providers, and that does confuse things a little bit. If you stick with universities, which is the group that I represent, it's a pretty strong message. If you study this set of things, there's a market opportunity for you, and we will work with you to make that process at the end less lumpy and ridiculous, so that you can be the doctor you've trained to be, you can be the nurse you've trained to be, and that we so desperately need.
Okay, and so if as a result there are some people, through no fault of their own, that come here and they find it's a bit harder to stay because they're in an area that's not as needed, is that fair enough? Would you be understandable in that approach, even if that makes it a bit harder maybe for unis to attract some people and they go, well, hang on, it's a bit harder to stay in Australia with this type of degree? Is that fair enough? If
under the review that's been very well conducted by the team, the government puts into place provisions which just sort out who can stay and who can't stay in a more rational fashion, because the way we've done it thus far hasn't been that rational, hasn't been that useful, we'd have no problem with that at all.
And it unclogs the system, if you like, as well.
Unclogging the system would be a good idea.
What types of degrees do you think are oversubscribed right now in terms of overseas students?
Well, I wouldn't really describe them as oversubscribed, Tom, because they're coming here to study stuff for themselves and in many cases the home country they're going home to. So
what about the ones that are staying here and often staying but not using their degrees? Because there are stats on that. Are there degrees in mind for that you think realistically You know, you're not sitting there saying, I don't want you to come. You want people to come here and study. But who's it going to be harder to stay for? What type of degrees do you think?
Well, skills we have needs for, it'll be easy for you to stay. So I say again, so engineering, nurses, doctors, those sorts of things, really, really high skilled individuals, it'll be easier for them to stay.
Something in the arts, humanities, probably harder?
No, I wouldn't
say this as someone that studied humanities. I'm not being disparaging.
Well, I think we have a 100% humanities table right here. You gain a very large range of skills, and there'll be skill shortages in those areas. The sort of flexibility of mind, the sort of adaptability, the sort of communication skills you gain there are also very useful.
What about defence jobs? Because we keep hearing it's hard to recruit and they're going to look for different sort of skilled jobs. Obviously, we try locally. Is this something where there's a big opportunity for overseas students to come? There'll be sensitivities around whether they can work in some defence jobs, I suppose, or is that a domestic thing?
There are constraints already, and Defence should have a little bit of a think about that. There are obvious sensitivities. There are, however, enormous skill shortages in Defence, and AUKUS is making that so clear. 200,000, I think, is the number of jobs the government's outlined we need by 2035. We cannot possibly fill those unless we do something very serious domestically here at home to make sure that we're making more places available for students, and we're providing more incentives to go into that really
Can we do it
large
only domestically? I mean, the limitation, presumably you can't be a foreign national working within the ADF, but maybe there's a quicker pathway to get overseas students into that. Do you think we can fill it domestically?
Look, domestically I think is the main focus. I think Defence has got a bit of thinking to do, and we made some recommendations about this in our submission to the Defence Strategic Review about whether they can loosen up a little bit, be a bit more flexible, but obviously there are sensitivities and constraints there. Yeah,
so you'll have sort of, was that in the review? So I mean, I haven't read every single page. Did they have a comment on that? Did you hear back about it?
Look, we've had good, fruitful conversations. They've mostly focused on what we do domestically.
Okay, that's sort of, they're staying for that for now, and maybe if they need to, they'll branch out, I guess.
We'll keep encouraging.
Final brief question. The Minister also said overall she imagines that the program will actually shrink a little bit, migration. Would that be in your sector as well? Have you sought assurances?
We've not had conversations along those lines.
Whether there'd be fewer students that could come?
Well, we've not had conversations along those lines. We think that we need more knowledge, more university-based knowledge for things like the Defence Strategic Review, like all the new jobs that simply require more education, not less. So we think we need more smart, skilled, educated students rather than fewer.
Catriona Jackson, thanks for your time today.
Pleasure.